Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm Donna Glassley. I'm from CGI Federal, and that's where I work. But today, the role of which I am most proud is to be an individual contributor on Renee's program committee, and also to be able to introduce our moderator for today. He's a gentleman who is most qualified to address the subject of buying IT as a commodity, because he's a brilliant contracting officer, a very creative thinker. But today he's acting in the moderator role, largely because of his body of work. He manages a team that oversees a portfolio of about $1.5 billion in size. And he's been doing this for only about 15 years, but he's a Fed 100 winner from Computer Week, so he's a highly recognized fellow. But he also has a great voice. He's very organized. He has a very good chin, and he dresses great, and so he could, in addition to all of his other qualities, fulfill the role of game show host very well. But I think he's actually going to be able to add a lot of color and humor and everything else to what should be a very lively panel discussion. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce your moderator for today, Chris Ham.
Good morning, everybody. I think that's the first time I ever got chin props. All right, so the panel today is on commodity purchasing of IT. It's a huge topic, a variety of subjects. We're fortunate to have 3 speakers from 3 different agencies that are going to be our subject matter experts. I'm going to go through and introduce them first, and we're going to start off with some basic questions and statements from me to the panel, and then throughout the rest of the conversation, it's going to be an open dialogue, so it'll be an opportunity for anyone to ask questions directly to the panel, and then to provide feedback and normal Q&A. In order to ask a question, you just press the button on your microphone in front of you, and it'll light up for you to ask your question. And when you ask questions, make sure you just tell us your name and company or organization so that we can go through and make sure that you sign up on the waiver so you can be on the record, I guess. So our panelists today, starting right here, we have John Johnson from GSA. John has a number of years working as a contracting officer and then a number of years working on the program side, developing complex commodity solutions within GSA for mobility, infrastructure as a service, and the tying together of all of that hardware into a package price. So it's going to give us one perspective, particularly on how we're buying things now that's more complicated than just buying a specific unit or device. Patrick Breen, formerly originally from Treasury, some time with GSA, now working in the National Park Service, will give us more of a small agency perspective on how they're buying commodities, and more on the buyer side versus on the vehicle creation. And then our rock star of the panel, we have Joanne, who is basically founded and created the way that the majority of spend for specific commodities and complex commodities are buying through NASA Soup, of which I have used your vehicles many, many, many times. So we've got all 3 perspectives here, and I'm going to go through and give everybody an opportunity to just real quickly introduce what your name, title, role is at your organization, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. So starting with John.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. My name is John Johnson. I am with the General Service Administration, as Chris mentioned. I am the Managed Mobility Program Manager. We developed and addressed mobile device management and application management for the federal government as part of Digital Government Strategy 5.5. Prior to that, I was a contracting officer dealing with cloud computing and cloud technologies through the Infrastructure as a Service BPA, Email as a Service BPA that GSA has. And even prior to that, thinking about looking at cloud and how that fits in with IT Schedule 70. There was something that we started addressing or looking at back in 2009, 2010. I also had written a piece for National Contract Management magazine back in that was published April 2012 that had to do with some of the challenges in terms of procuring cloud computing, and the title of which is shifting to a utilitization model of IT in procuring the cloud. So that pretty much sums it up.
Mr. Breen?
All right, my name is Patrick Breen. I'm currently the Bureau Procurement Chief for the National Park Service. So in that role, I'm really responsible for all acquisition, financial assistance, and credit card programs and policies across the Bureau. Right now, we are targeting IT commodities as one of our big areas to aggregate buying power across the regions. We have a very, very diverse, geographically diverse workforce. Often sites of no more than one person in really remote locations. So we're trying to figure out how to best leverage existing vehicles from GSA or from NASA or the department to try to secure some better commodity buying power across the organization. Prior to taking this job, I was with that GSA FedSim. I also spent about 9.5 years at Treasury doing mostly complex IT requirements, but specifically large-scale tax systems at IRS.
I won't sing. I was a rock star. So I'm Joanne Wojtek. I'm the program manager for NASA SOUP. For those who don't know what SOUP is, we're actually the original pilot GWAT back in '92. I was just watching a TV show, won't name it, but if you watch it, you know it. It's Sunday mornings about government contracting, and they kept misusing the word GWAC. There are only 3 GWAC agencies, NIH, NASA, and GSA. And we were the original back in '92. SOUP is primarily concerned with product-based products and product-based services, whereas most of the other GWACs are more service-oriented. And the other key part to know about SOUP that is both a challenge and of course a sense of pride too is along with GSA, we're the only contract that can say that every agency uses us. Not that every agency can use us, but every agency uses us. I always challenge somebody to think of some minor little agency out there, and yeah, they've used us. It's amazing when we see that. But we do a lot to help those agencies get their IT and similar products as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Mm-hmm. So the buying of commodity in some ways has a negative term in that it's commoditization. It's the reduction of the profit margin for industry because the stuff is just being sold without any sort of value-added services. We're also looking at reducing our commodity spend in order to be more efficient by aggregating our buying power. In 2012, there was a big effort from the portfolio stat at the reduction of commodity spending. It was actually a massive number that was recommended. It was $2.4 billion that was going to be reduced through the portfolio stat process for reducing spend, not necessarily by less, but being more efficient in it. So my question first to the panel is there any sort of significant reduction in the scale of what you're seeing through commodity contracting, particularly on the SOUP and the GSA ITS vehicles? Are the numbers going down? Are they flat? Are they going up? Is that having a net impact on the purchasing side, or is it just being more efficient in its spend?
Well, I would say that the biggest change we've seen is more agency-wide and site-wide purchasing versus single item purchasing. Our average order size has increased. Our total dollar amount has stayed pretty even throughout the past 4 or 5 years. There hasn't been when you add in modifications and options, it's been pretty steady. But there's definitely a trend towards larger buys at once rather than trying to do it onesie twosie. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that changes. And just to stray a little bit off the topic of your question, but just it was interesting the commodity statement. I think one of the questions out there is, is everything really a commodity when you buy it? I mean, I think commodities sounds like it's sort of like COTS. It becomes this word that you just throw out. Not you, but the government just throws out, and it suddenly becomes a catch-all for all sorts of things that maybe it shouldn't be. There's definitely commodity buys, but there's a lot of things government needs to have that does need a value add, and we have to be careful about going too far one way or the other.
And I like very much what Joanne just said. In terms of the effect of purchasing on both the SOUP and let's just say IT Schedule 70 as an example, I think it would be very difficult to tell what is happening in the federal marketplace in terms of how it's affecting both of our vehicles, because you have a simultaneous sort of budget crisis is not the right word, but agencies are spending less now than they had before, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, or since 2009, 2010. There's less resources available, which certainly affects their commodity purchases on either one of our vehicles. But I really like what Joanne said in terms of the use of language and how use of language in the government can somehow or sometimes shape the way that people look at something, whether it's commodity IT or even cloud, as an example. Cloud is very different when you're talking infrastructure, when you're talking virtual machines, when you're talking different software as a service sort of offerings that are available that right now don't lend itself to a commodity analogy.
Well, one of the best things about purchasing commodities as a service is you can have a just-in-time model. So whenever you have to have a fourth panelist arrive just in time, you can simply turn on their microphone and they can introduce their background from DHS.
Great. Greg Capella. I work as the Deputy Executive Director at ESDO, which is the office within the headquarters, CIO, that does 10 of the 12 cloud efforts and supports the other 2 that DHS does. We do enterprise applications, and we are actually involved in supporting Genie, who's actually producing our next generation of compute vision and implementing that. And it was a beautiful commute, almost 1 hour.
So once we get past the initial questions about scale and volume of IT purchasing, the next area I want to go is to who's the buyer side of it. Who's the integrator in 2014 versus who it was in 2003? Are you seeing that the government still fulfilling the role as the individual purchaser of the item itself and then handing it over to a contractor as GFE in the predominance model, or is it a system integrator that's acquiring it and then integrating into your environment, or even that next step of all of that is transparent because you're buying it as a service in the first place? Is there a general trend where it's increasing, changing, or is it still divergent across the agencies?
Do you want to hit it, John? Or? So what we're seeing is actually something a little bit even different, and I think you've heard in the industry the broker model. We want to instill a contract with a third party. They in turn have relationships with multiple potential vendors. We don't want to have that direct relationship for multiple reasons. First is we want to basically allow the marketplace to better provide solutions at the best price. If I create, for instance, a contract with vendor ABC, and that vendor doesn't perform, well, over the next 2 years, I might be able to get a case in place to actually remove that vendor and award a new contract. Obviously, too little, too late. What we want to do is use that broker and the ability of the purchasing power. If that first provider to that broker doesn't work, they go to vendor 2. If that doesn't work, they go to vendor 3. We migrate our loads to where it makes the most sense financially and who provides the best services. We don't want to be tethered via contract and via a system that was built to ensure parity and fairness in the FAR to a single vendor. Rather, we want to use that same FAR to get to a broker that in turn provides, much like we get our power. Right now in my house, I don't know if I'm getting my power from the Northeast utility or wherever. I don't care. What I do care about is the results.
Any other thoughts?
So we, at least at the Park Service, we've got a little bit of a different issue. We're not obviously as large as DHS, but we're also fairly remote, and we have low dollar requirement in a lot of our locations, which does require us to have a direct relationship with one single vendor, which is one single point of failure then. That vendor doesn't work on our point of sale system, for example. We are locked up in disputes for years with no real system to help us take in fee revenue. Conversely, we have to act as our own integrator at a lot of these sites as well, because we have literally 1 to 5 people at many of these sites, and if you've got no one there, and it's one automated fee machine, which is one of our bigger IT requirements, and there are 2 companies that make them, we're on the waiting list. So it's the smaller your agency gets and the more diverse, geographically diverse you get in the population of those sites really kind of determines how you have to structure that contract, that integration effort, and where the burden there for performance really lies.
Moving in and then not moving in.
I always have something to say. I think that you just heard two different agencies here with 2 different views. That was one of my points about soup and where we lie in it. It's interesting being in a situation where every agency is using you. Somebody have an agency come to us and say, "Why don't you do this?" and we all want our stuff this way. It's like, yeah, but the other agency doesn't. They have a different makeup, a different style. There's a big push now with OMB, federalizing everything. You're talking about millions of workers and thousands of places with it's nothing is that monolithic in answer to any of those sort of questions. So you're always going to have a variety, and you're always going to have the taste of the month, or whatever is the big thing to talk about. Is the thing that it grabs onto, and there's always some truth to it, but not for everybody. And so you have to find what works for each agency and their position. I think to try to find one solution is doomed to failure.
We never hear that at GSA. It's sort of funny. I mean, I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out, and I know that Joanne and her staff do as well, how to fix their problems. What can we do in order to, help them acquire and procure what it is that they need in a timely manner that that has a potential to capture economies of scale, but also helps drive down their costs. And I think the similarity between both NASA SOUP and GSA and the way we think of it is initially helping driving down those transition costs, or I should say the transaction costs that are associated with either one of them procuring what it is that they need. Again, in 2012, I wrote and I'm going to beg to differ with you on occasion. I don't see, and I still don't see, federal acquisition regulations being a problem to do what it is that needs to be done. Some of that, I think, is perceptual, but there are ways that, it's sort of an evolution as industry changes. I mean, the scenario that you're bringing up right now requires a homogeneous environment between cloud providers that make it easy to transition. Even if you're serving a broker role, how do I get my data from environment A to environment B seamlessly, like you would with a utility, like you would with a phone company or an electric company? And that's that. I don't know if that is necessarily this all started in the 50s and 60s, right, with MIT and with Professor John McCarthy saying that cloud computing or compute was going to end up being a public utility. Now, don't get nervous, industry. I don't think that cloud computing is going to be a public utility in the near future, but that's where some of the framework comes in terms of looking at it as a utility. Maybe it'll get there, maybe it won't, but I think Joanne and I are both going to continue to think about it and try to develop solutions that at least help you slowly get to where it is that you're looking to go.
So we're making the analogy here to a utility. And there are similarities, but there are also fundamental differences in terms of the regulatory framework around utilities, the capital cost and access to the environment, and the number of providers. So the question we have on the brokerage side is, are there sufficient contractual approaches to get to and providers in the brokerage model today to be able to effectively use that approach?
I would think that that may be the hardest problem we're facing is actually the contractual agreements and how to structure those. Technology is maturing. It's not quite there yet, openly. Moving the data is always going to be the harder part. We can make a Windows 2008 R2 look similar across multiple platforms if you accept the position that I will accept the de facto format. So I can't tweak it up. I can't have patch 13 applied, not patch 24. And that's one of our dilemmas is almost every app out there seems to want to tweak up their implementation. So what we've had to do as we've implemented our cloud for dev test, and just for context, we did this in-house first. So about 4 years ago, we stood up our in-house dev test cloud. We have 1,400 virtual servers. In the same data center, we have about the same number of physicals. Now, the size is obviously different. The physicals tend to be larger. But net is that we've had acceptance. But the acceptance meant that you had to accept compromise. And that's hard. It's very hard to do when I can get an extra 10% performance if I tweak it up. However, when you're in a budget-constrained environment like we are today, we are seeing people willing to accept more compromise, to go to a common footprint, to use common infrastructure. Will I be able to take any product off the street and use it in a broker model? No. That's absurd. There's always going to be proprietary solutions. But there's a level of that infrastructure, a level of that solution that can be migrated that is similar. An Oracle database can be made to look fairly similar to another Oracle database, a SQL, Mongo, whatever. Migrating that data is always going to be the crux of the technology side of how do I make that effective migration so I can continue my operation. Or do I make data marts? Technology has to mature. But the compute is probably easier than the contracts. We have an amazing contract shops in DHS. I got to brag on them. They're wonderful to work with. They're thinking outside the box, and they're trying to help us make that. We're teaming with TSA, trying to think of how we might be able to do the broker. It's going to be tough, and we're going to try to work it through.
All right, so trivia question for everybody, which gets to an important commodity issue. Does anyone know why the brand name justification rules exist? When they were created and how they happened? For commodities, in 2005, there was a significant war between two of the chip manufacturers, Intel and AMD. Whenever we bought something, when we bought a commodity, we bought a computer, we said we wanted a Pentium something. And so that excluded ADM from the market. So that created a rule we need to publish what it is that the justification for picking something. Now, writ large, almost 10 years later, we've got the same sort of problem whenever we're looking at cloud environments. There's a significant company that we use when we look things up on the internet that has a couple of G's and a couple of O's in it, that has one environment. And then there's another one that controls a desktop that has another environment. And then there's all the ones that resell that kind of environment, plus a bunch of others that host it. So as a buyer, you're trying to buy email as a commodity. And you just want to buy something that will work with your environment. And you've done your market research and you've identified that one of these two things is perhaps a better fit for your technical infrastructure versus the other. What is the approach? Do you designate that I want to go with a specific brand for that commodity, for that service? Or do you go with the equal and then let them shoot it out? How do you get through that? How do you navigate through that process?
You said you've done it.
I'm a moderator, not answering the question.
Yeah, and that's... Fortunately, Greg has a lot of good, smart contracting officers over at DHS that can help him navigate through that. Rather than saying anything that could get contracting officers or GSA in trouble, the things to remember and the things that need to be done are talk about what you want in your requirements, what it is that you require or what your objectives are, and B, conduct your procurement in accordance with competition rules that are outlined in the FAR. Now, there are again, I can feel myself getting on that slippery slope. I am perfectly comfortable advising agencies on how to identify a compliant acquisition pathway of least resistance so that they can satisfy those rules and ultimately get the customer, their customer that they're supporting, what they want in the most risk-free is not the right word, but where risk is managed, but efficiency and effectiveness are paramount.
Greg, do you see any sort of nuance to this?
Well, I was going to say a couple things. One is, as a former technical person, I just want to buy what I want to get and not have to worry about that other. If I know it's the G one, I want that one. But of course, that's not the way the FAR works. And I've had to change my views as I become more in the procurement world. But at the same time, I think back to why SOUP actually exists, and it was to actually back in the 90s there was a company called DEC, and everything was and they were all constant. In order to get things done quickly, there was just this constant brand name requirements going out to try to skip around some of the competition parts. And the reason they started SOUP was to make it easier to get competition, basically. So it seems to me that the quest, there's two parts to that can help. One is defining exactly what you really need, of course, and then the other one is having an easy way to get to it. If it's going to take you 12 months to do a full competition and you want it tomorrow, and if I can do a brand name and get it tomorrow, then that's going to have a major effect on somebody. But if we can set up our rules and that's why essentially GWAX exists. That's why GSA exists. That's why we set up large programs like the HS has, so that it's easier for people to get to them. If you don't have that ease, then the technical person is going to push hard to just get that answer today and not wait. So that's the challenge.
And I have to advocate, we want to go to capabilities, not saying brand name. It rarely benefits us unless there's some market-leading solution that has no competition. It rarely benefits us to actually try to go there. For one, if they are that far ahead, often you're locked in. I mean, and then we often pay quite a bit to sustain that solution. So I'd rather specify I need an email solution and let the market battle it out. I mean, who knew 10 years ago, besides people within Apple, that the iPhone was going to basically revolutionize what we carry in our pockets? I mean, we have basically a full interface to the net and to texting and email 24/7. Who would have thought that? I mean, who knows what's going to happen the next 3 years, let alone, the next decade. To lock myself in would be, I think, extremely counterproductive.
So let's go to the next logical recompete. You've done your competition, you've awarded something, and you've gotten an environment of a specific type from a certain company. Now we're getting at that transition stickiness from an existing environment. And is that the scenario where the brand name becomes relevant and you're competing amongst providers of that? Is that where the cloud brokerage could solve your problem, or is it still start and do a competition based on the requirements only?
So when we're talking about the broker, what we're trying to do is set up relationships for, in x86 computing, or we're talking Linux, or we're talking requirements along those levels, not hopefully, there will be things like I want a Sun OS, or I want, AIX, or whatever it may be. That's going to happen, but hopefully we'll stay into the area where there's competition amongst multiple vendors, or we can get a good price point. So we will try to avoid going down those cul-de-sacs, and we'll try to get our solutions to be rebuilt off the proprietary platforms onto more open source and more solutions that are able to go across. Migrating between environments is never going to be trivial. There's always going to be tweaking. There's always going to be some amount of work. At the infrastructure level, there's a number of groups who are working very well to create technologies that allow movement between environments. And some pretty good success there. We're hoping to leverage that, but we don't expect it to be a panacea. We expect some costs. But if you take a step back, what the broker is trying to do is compel the market to respond to the user and not basically sit on the laurels if they win a contract. If you win today, and I've made a solution with a particular vendor, they basically lock me in for the length of that contract unless I really work hard to get rid of them. I mean, it's really quite hard to remove a vendor. You all know that. In the courts, for a price of a stamp, it seems, you can delay actions for quite some time in many cases. From our point of view, we want to get back from that, have competition on a regular basis between our vendors, where we, the government, don't have to go for every micro purchase, and we're talking small purchases, hundreds of dollars, not thousands, not millions, every time we award or go get another VM, and have them compete amongst themselves, provide us the best solution at the best price without us having to recompete.
Mr. Boone? John?
Well, I mean, so the thing with transition costs is they're never insignificant when you go out to do any sort of thing. And email is a good example because once, and the same thing happened with the identical email system at the General Service Administration. Once we got that in place and you look at the functionality, other things other than email, lots of things happen. And so, sorry. So when you look towards transitioning, especially from an email system or from any sort of system where there are fundamentally different camps with similar but very different functionalities, and you go out with that requirement, even if your requirement is I need email and I need these other things to be supported, the burden's on how you write that and how industry receives that to really help mitigate those transition costs. Because even if you go a paper transition from supplier A to supplier B of the same service, that's still a lot of time, effort, and even if it's all hosted in the cloud, whose cloud is it hosted on and how does that get migrated and transition? Now, when you put those lists out and you list your physical boxes and here are the operating systems on those and here's what we have in a virtual environment, you often get something that looks strikingly similar, but maybe with some sorts of changes. You're never going to get an epic shift from what you have today to a net new solution if you've already invested a significant amount of time, resource, and effort into maintaining an environment. So it really is incumbent on those folks out there. And the broker situation is actually probably the best at that point. How can they broker a deal if not to transition on day one, but to get to a more ideal looking solution 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long down the road, because that helps us mitigate our costs because our budgets are not getting bigger anytime soon. And also helps mitigate sort of some of the startup costs for a new contract. But it does become very difficult. You're not locked in, but you're not exactly free to move around.
And so two things here. First, I want to create a new expression. The protest cost used to be the price of a stamp. GA has recently received the authority to charge a fee for it, so now I want to create the expression that the cost of a nice dinner on K Street, so I think it's $200 or something is what the fee would be in order to file a protest. Still insignificant in terms of protest challenging. Secondly, it was about the other parts, the bundles of what we're buying. So how do you address on the buying side of this when you're looking at buying email as a service, infrastructure as a service, and provider A has 15 things that come in the bundle, and provider B has 12, and you asked for some or all of them, and some of them value. How do you deal with the fact that the industry isn't homogenous in their service offerings? You're getting some pluses and some minuses across the board. How are you making those? How do you craft a requirement that says I'm going to buy something when what everybody's offering back is so varied?
Isn't that what they call source selection? I'm sorry, no, just teasing. There's never been, on the source selection I've done dozens, I've never seen an exact identical offering from both vendors, anything sophisticated. So you always have to have some judgment. Now, the judgment comes down to as technology evolves, and part of the broker model is to adapt to new technologies, is that change or that additional feature function worth the delta costs, and is that a fair and reasonable competition, right? You have to keep the playing field reasonable. You can't have someone come in from left field, change the paradigm, and then sucker punch the other guy. But net is that you want competition. You want to be able to look at the feature function and how it can improve. If it's fair, if it's reasonable, why not?
I mean, that's exactly there. The real key is how are we running the source selections and how have we written that initial statement of requirements, statement of objectives, whatever it is. But I think as we've all experienced, trade-off decisions in a source selection are not very easy. They're often not as well documented as they should be, which gets us into some of those people donating for a nice dinner in K Street. So it really comes down to we need to ensure that not only are the evaluators trained in how to do the evaluation process, what a trade-off really means, and getting them really involved in justifying that, which is not something you see everywhere. You do see it at FedSim, so use FedSim if you're using assisted acquisition, but you do see some places do it much better than others. Or you can see some of the places I've been where it's at the end of the day, a technical evaluation team throws something over the fence, and it's up to a person that maybe has some sort of minor understanding of what they're trying to buy to justify the difference, and sometimes a fairly large difference in price, for a couple of nice-to-haves, where there is some value, but how do you do that? So it really is a training issue on the evaluation side of this, and specifically with the contracting staff and with the evaluators.
How about on the vehicle creation side, for NASA and for GSA? How varied are the solutions that you're getting for the specific commodity areas?
As varied as you want. I mean, it's we do 25,000 orders a year, and so there's 25,000 different ways of doing things. I know not that many, but certainly a large variation. So, I mean, I will say what's one of the funny things about requirements and doing them right and not doing them right. We certainly have, hopefully on the bigger end, when there's huge ones, they do it right. But we've had people come to us and say, so I want a cloud solution. I have $1 million. What can I get? And I've actually had customers come to me and say this, like, what do you want? I say, well, can I just go out and say, I have $1 million, give me a solution? I said, no, you have to give them requirements. And they wanted us to craft the solution based on the amount of budget that they had. That's the wrong way to do it, but that does happen. Yes.
Once again, we at GSA have no idea what you're talking about. We've never been exposed to any of that before. It's interesting because each has brought this up in a different way. And again, let's go back to utility, right? You're not buying, just like at your house, you don't buy a megahertz or a gigawatt. Excuse me. Let's go. What do you do with a gigawatt? You don't call up the electric company and say, send me over some gigawatts. No, there's a big effort that goes along with getting that gigawatt into your house, into the wiring in your house, to everything else that allows for the tools that you're using to actually run off of that gigawatt. So there's a large transition component that's been recognized, and migration component, and is it going to end up getting to that vision again that Greg speaks of? Maybe, especially with mobility. Mobility in the mobile environment is really, I think, where you're going to see a larger cloud component playing in the federal space, with the smartphones, with the tablets, and how those devices interact with not only your back-end systems, but possibly your cloud-based infrastructure. So this is going to be a continual evolution. I mean, one thing that I've been toying with is the use of, again, I tend not to blame the FAR. I tend to try to find the wiggle where the wiggle exists. GSA, and I know that folks within the Alliant GWAC and with FedSim really leverage the FAR 51 deviation authority that is allowable by GSA, which allows vendors to procure on behalf of an agency if they're given a letter of agency. They do have to do it in accordance with 8.4, but that's one way that agencies can start playing around with a brokerage-like environment. There's rules to how you can use that. You have to put the empty CLINs in with the solicitation as you put it out there. But there's a mechanism that exists that can start getting you, especially for the one-offs, because you got that empty CLIN. You need a virtual machine here, your virtual machine there. You don't care what it is. Oftentimes, your integrators can kind of help take care of that on your behalf with the proper oversight. So there's wiggle and there's ways right now, but this is all stuff that's continuing to evolve.
Can you talk a little bit more about that one? Because that, in terms of when I interact with potential customers, almost no one knows about that flexibility. It's not widely publicized on how to execute it. So can you go a little bit more on the ability to be able to buy through the secondary approach with a vendor?
Well, and you're absolutely right. It's a very powerful tool to use. The problem really comes down to is how many contracting officers know about it, and the answer is not a whole lot. I mean, it's not something I can't probably name more than 2 people that have ever read FAR Part 51 or know where to find it.
When the deviation itself is even different than 51. So
it is, and the biggest problem is then how do you implement this? And this goes back, unfortunately, to training for acquisition professionals, especially 1102s, is fundamentally broken. Because there's no real emphasis anymore on being creative, on thinking outside the box. But the big hang up with that deviation and with the entire delegation is how does that interact with subcontracting and consent to subcontract? So there are a lot of moving parts there, but if you do it right, and I know it's a solution I've recommended to folks before, we get to a quasi-broker solution where they are free to enter into agreements to move stuff around within a certain box of constraints. And you have to clearly call out what that box is as you put that requirement out.
And the way it's written, at least the deviation, again, says that agencies can leverage this so long as that which is being procured is ancillary without being necessarily integral to the system that you're procuring. And the interesting thing is, the example that they use is, okay, if you're buying, if you've got a $1 million cap and you're buying $950,000 worth of stuff and you want that to be purchased using that authority, that might not fly. However, we don't put numbers, we don't put quantity, we don't put price on that in order for that to be leveraged.
No, and that's absolutely correct, and that goes back to understanding the programmatic requirements, working with the client to understand what their actual needs are, and that wiggle room on where that should fall on the overall spectrum of estimated costs is a very, very powerful tool depending on how you define what you're buying, what is the service versus what is the stuff. And if you do it right, you can really help your clients to get incredible solutions they could not do in any other method.
All right, so we're starting talking about FAR. So we already got a little bit eggheady on how to buy stuff. Now let's talk about appropriations law. Let's talk about how you fund this stuff. It's being sold with elasticity on the unit. And you have X number of something you want to buy, but if it's successful, it's going to go up. How much money do you have to obligate? How do you manage the upside and downside? I'm particularly sensitive to this because I just got my natural gas bill for the month, and prices have spiked. In case you haven't gotten yours yet, it's going to be like 2 or 3 times higher than what you were expecting before. So how do you deal with the variability of the commodity as a service?
And not to get far geeky, but this really comes down to how you structure the contract type and what you're comfortable using. This is, unless you have the best requirements development shop known to man, this is nowhere on the kind of low risk end of the spectrum for contract pricing. What we're really talking about here is setting up either an indefinite delivery requirements contract, which is painful, single agency use, base vehicle sort of stuff, or we look more towards cost type contracting, where we have an end state, we have some goals, we want to manage costs, we want to manage all the stuff that goes around with that, which requires a lot more dedication out of not only the contracting staff, but also the programmatic staff to manage appropriately and to understand what the impact of every minor decision is on the overall cost value of that vehicle.
We actually implemented and have been using for about 3 years now what we call a drawdown account. What we do is we pre-price the CLINs, and so they're a unit price for a unit device, let's say a VM or for even a block of services, 80 hours of services. And you can buy those from the drawdown. So the contracting officer obligates a set of funds, let's say $1 million. Within that $1 million, as the year goes on, you can choose how those are executed, and then there's a delegation to if you will, an equivalent of an ordering official, I think is what the FAR calls them. But net is they get the opportunity to approve which of those individual units are purchased. Since the pre-priced CLINs, what you're really doing is just executing because the quantities are going to change over time, and you can't predict, because hopefully the price will go down, right, as technology matures. So we're using that, and it seems to work quite well. Now, back to your point about, I think you made it, Patrick, was that the person being the ordering official equivalent has to be really on top of their game. You have to watch that like a hawk, and you need a lot of reports. You have to make sure, because basically you have to make sure you don't go anti-deficient. It's easy to spend when you start getting into that mode of meeting that next mission requirement, wherever, hit the fan that day. It's easy to lose the focus on the fact that your bills are 2, 3, 4 weeks behind in their bill cycle, right? You get billed from past activities, not future. And the fact you could overspend. So you have to be very cautious on that, and we've had good luck. So far, we've not had any incidents. But overall, it's a very successful effort in terms of using funds effectively, given this model. It is tough on the contracting officers. It's tough on the individual ordering official, but we think that's the method we want to try to go forward with for most of our efforts. There are some efforts we chose not to use that same metaphor for because of the, like in infrastructure service, there's a long lead. You can't put something in production without going through control boards and all those other things. So we did not choose it there, but other places we did.
And I would think, Greg, that over time, I mean, one of the problems with budgeting for cloud, particularly for any sort of virtual machine or infrastructure as a service related effort that you have going on, is you have no past history to go by in order to identify when those peaks and when those valleys typically happen, like you can do with your telecommunications, like you can do with your electricity, like you can do with some of the other utility-like functions. So I would think that over time, as you sort of look to see what happened, you're going to be in a much better position to be able to budget for that in the future. And I also think that it's probably easier to do budget-wise for SaaS offerings than infrastructure, because you have something that is clearly in terms of email or even cloud-based mobile device management. You know how many devices you have. You know how many email boxes that you need. You know how many. So there's a little bit more stability, I would think.
I would argue with you that you know that the first time you do it. The first time you do it, you don't know how much you have. The second time you do it, then you know.
Actually, our experience was actually just the opposite. When it came to things like email, the migrations, you would think, hey, it's Microsoft Exchange. Well, guess what? Lawyers keep every bloody record of anything that deals with a case. Law enforcement people have to keep their records sometimes for 70 years. So you hit those mailboxes, and suddenly you go from 1,000 boxes migrating a day down to 20, 30, 50. Right? As you migrate these enormous multiple gigabyte or terabyte boxes. So what we found is that because of the ups and downs, even of something like a commodity like email, which is in this case just Exchange, we had problems predicting. So as you would think, just the opposite, right? A mature offering, you could touch it, you could feel it. No, it was actually quite fluid. And it goes back, I think, to your migrations. There'll never be a perfect migration. You always have flux.
So there's two issues and that you brought up, and one I think is easier, and I think that's the one that we touched upon, which is if you have a fixed price, so it's so much per mailbox, or it's so much per CPU power. That one I think is easy. The hard one is the one that you more mentioned, Chris, which is this hour it's 10 cents per CPU, and next hour is 20 cents per CPU because there's a whole lot of people wants it. It's the HOV toll lane issue of you don't know how much it's going to be until you get there, and in fact it could change while you're on the road, and you could change while you and that I don't have an answer for that. In fact, that's the one that I would say. When people come to us and say, can we use Soup for cloud? I say, not for that. Because there's no way, I don't have a fixed price to give you. It's going to change by time. So there needs to be different solutions that can handle that variability and not get you into the deficiency issue of all of a sudden, it costs more than you had planned for because you don't have a way to plan for that.
So when we did with the drawdown, all of our CLINs are fixed price. So for instance, devices, we all experience the device prices move pretty darn quickly, and they're obsolescent within months, right, sometimes. What we did was we actually have them rebid new CLINs for new devices or new plans. So we actually have a evergreen, is what I call it, CLIN list for devices. And we vet it in a prescribed manner. But that was one way to approach it. I think there's 1,000 different ways out there that I think over time. But ultimately what you're pointing out, I think, is exactly the dilemma. We are going to see a ever-changing broker model evolving and growing and maturing as we go forward. When we start off, infrastructure will probably be easy. Couple services, easy. Some of the other things are not going to work in the broker model exactly. And we'll have to work through the mechanics of that and how to make it work in that particular set of paradigms.
So what I'm hopeful for is there's some sort of, like iTunes on my iPad for my kid control, or Uber-based, it says that it's snowing and it's going to be 10 times as much, that there's a stop thing that pops up on my buyer side that says, no, don't buy it now, don't take the Uber in the snowstorm, take it another time. So hopefully there's some sort of way that's put into the commodity offering.
Yep. So we have actually, I get warnings when I approve, and I'm an approving official for I think about 10 or 12 different organizations or offerings. I actually see how much is in the bank account, if you will, or underneath, I call it a checking account, and I can actually see how much my charges will be, and they project it out for the year. And so I can actually tell how much to anticipate might be the burn down. And then when I get toward the end, I start sweating. So
Careful with the overdraft because it's a killer.